Welcome back. We are continuing in Judges. We're in the Samson story. We've already looked at sort of the first part of it. So we're going to continue on and see what else we can learn from Samson, who is a good example of a bad example. So let's jump in. So last time I left you with a couple of questions. How many times is Yahweh mentioned in the Samson story? And the answer is not enough. When Yahweh is mentioned, especially in the beginning with his parents, that's sort of a little bit special. But when Samson actually comes onto the page, so to speak, he's mentioned almost not at all. Samson does mention him a couple of times, but it's out of a selfish desire, not out of a way to glorify Yahweh. And so the second question is Yahweh glorified by Samson? No, not really. Yahweh is really being used here as a little God, God with a little g, as a means for Samson to get what he wants by appeasing and manipulating God to those ends. God's kind of like a lucky rabbit's foot for Samson to a certain extent. Samson really doesn't demonstrate any knowledge of him because he calls on him when he's thirsty. God does heed him, gives him something to drink, but Samson did it because he's thirsty, not because he wanted to bring glory to Yahweh's name. So we see here Samson being a good example of a bad example because he epitomizes what Israel has sown up until this point. He is that fruit. So previously we saw that Samson was set apart. He has Nazirite vows that limit him of what he can do as a Israelite man, yet he doesn't pay attention to that. We saw that with his interaction with the lion's corpse. He doesn't pay attention to his Nazirite vows, and with that, he doesn't really pay attention to his covenant that he has with God just by being an Israelite man, of no foreign women and worshiping God alone. Like we see that Samson even violates those things. So he's set apart, yet he doesn't really care, which shows you that he is the fruit of Israel, because Israel doesn't really care that they're set apart either. So these two work well. Samson sort of embodies or pictures what Israel is at this time, because Israel is reaping what they have sown. Samson is that fruit. We saw them sowing heavily, really at the end of Joshua and at the beginning of Judges, and we're seeing some of that stuff start to come up. They keep getting handed over to their enemies, and they're not learning the lesson because they keep turning back to the foreign gods. And so they've been essentially given up. By the time of the Samson story, they've been given up because they're not even crying out to Yahweh anymore for deliverance. But Yahweh, being the sovereign king of Israel, not intimidated by their lack of faithfulness, still keeps the covenant and is faithful to them. But we see the downward spiral continuing, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And honestly, at this point, I'm just so sick and tired of talking about it because it's like a broken record, the same thing over and over and over again. But that is what is happening, and the people aren't listening. And when we don't listen, similar things happen in our lives as well. So let's get right into it. Samson, a hammer in the hand of God. Let's look at chapter 15 and see what it has to say. One of the things we're going to see, as we saw sort of in the last video, is that Samson pursues the world and he gets worldly results. What we saw at the end of the story is that essentially his to-be wife, or his wife, because back then things worked a little bit different. Going through that wedding process, they would have been already sort of married or seen somewhat in that light. We see that his wife is given to another. And what is the father-in-law's reasoning? Well, you ran off, and so I thought you didn't want her anymore. But here, take her younger sister. We're about to read this anyways. And we're going to see how that turns out. But what happens when you pursue the world? You get worldly results. What happens when you deal with things in a worldly way? You have worldly things happen to you. So we kind of see these things happening. So let's jump straight into the scripture and start reading. So here we have it, Judges 15:1. Or let's back up. Judges 14:20. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So that's where we left it. Samson left and went back to his home. Right? In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and his wife is given to someone else. So now, time has passed. After a while, let's read what happens. Judges 15:1. After a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife. So it's like they're married, bringing along a kid. He said, I want to go into my wife's room. I wonder for what reason. But her father would not allow him to go in. So here you already have a conflict. Samson wants to go in to his wife's room for selfish reasons, probably because he wants to have sex with her, because it's his wife, right, in his sight. But then we learn what has happened here. Verse 2, her father said, I was sure that you had rejected her. So I gave her to your companion. Oops. Is not her younger sister prettier than she? Right? Worldly way, worldly results. Right? And then here you have a trying to deal with it again in a worldly way. Well, just take our younger sister. She's prettier. Why not take her instead? Verse 3, Samson said to them, this time, when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame, right? Because this wrong had been done to him. And we're going to see this happening through the Samson story, that you sort of have a tit for tat, right? Samson is wrong, so then he does wrong. And then the people he did wrong to want to do wrong back to Samson or back to Israel because they then received wrong. And it's just this repeating cycle of blame. And it just doesn't really seem to end, and it ends badly for everybody. Verse 4. So Samson, so what is he going to do in return? You sold my wife to someone else, and now I can't have her, so I'm going to cause mischief to the Philistines. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took some torches, and he turned the foxes tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. Now notice here, we're having here a connection with the Gideon story because there's 300 foxes. 300 foxes with torches, right? That resembles the 300 troops that had the torches with the when they're fighting the Midianites, I believe. So here's a connection to the Gideon story, wanting you to see these stories and linking them together. So what happens after this? Verse 5. When he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. Because remember, it's the wheat harvest. He went into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up the shocks and the standing grain as well as the vineyards and olive groves. So what's Samson doing? He's destroying the Philistine economic means, which is not smart. You never want to hit someone in their wallet because that's where people really get offended and start feeling it, right? But of course, Samson's intending to do this. He wants to make them upset. Verse 6, then the Philistines asked, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion. So people already know why this is happening. So the Philistines came up, watch this now, and burned her and her father. Remember what they had said earlier? Where is it? Like, coax your husband to explain the riddle to us. Remember, these are these 30 companions that Samson told the riddle to, and now they're trying to corner Samson's wife. Coax your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Well, what do we find here? They don't keep their word, because what happens? Where does it say it here? So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. It happened anyways. She was loyal to the Philistines, but then the Philistines, because of this mischief, come and burn her anyways. This is the world acting in worldly ways. Let's just look at that for a second. So well, how does Samson respond to his wife being taken? He takes 300 foxes with torches to ruin the harvest. Remember Gideon. This is reminiscent of the Gideon story. And we see this whole theme come back again. Brutality and treachery and cunning. I'm so sick and tired of talking about this. But this is what's being demonstrated in the scripture, and this is what is happening throughout. Brutality, treachery, and cunning. This is the way of the world, and it keeps happening again and again and again because the people aren't learning the lesson. This is the way of the world. This is how the world works. Brutality, treachery, and cunning. And we just saw that in the example in chapter 14, verse 15. We read that they were trying to coax the wife of Samson to betray the riddle to them so that they wouldn't have to pay. And they said, we're going to burn you in your father's house if you don't do it. But then we find out in 15:6 that they do that very thing anyways. So they don't keep their word. They just act out of whatever they need, their own selfish ambition to do whatever they want to get the results that they want because they don't keep their word. People of the world never keep their, or I shouldn't say they never keep their word, but it shouldn't surprise you when they go back on their word. And we see this happening here in the scripture. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. Samson did something, then they did something back. So what are you going to expect? What's going to happen next? I mean, this is a broken record by this time. Verse 7, Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I've taken revenge on you. So Samson's going to get his revenge. More brutality, more treachery. So verse 8, he struck them down hip and thigh with great slaughter, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Edom. So what happens here? Samson then retaliates again and kills a bunch of them, And then he goes and hides in a cave. Verse 9. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" Now remember, Judah and Israel are in subjection to the Philistines. So for the Philistines to come to attack them is a little weird because you already have subdued us. We're probably paying you some sort of tribute or whatever. So why are you attacking us? So this is a legitimate question. Why have you come up against us? They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he has done to us." Now look at here. To do to him as he did to us. That is the way of the world. You slap me, I'm going to slap you back. Right? You steal from me, I'm going to steal from you back. But that's not the way of God's people. And we see that demonstrated a lot in the New Testament by some of the things Jesus says, turn the other cheek. I mean, that has to do more with an insult. But you see here that you're supposed to treat other people how you want to be treated. You don't treat them the way that they treat you because the world treats you like crap. Right? And so we have this happening here. Samson doing the same thing back to them. And now the Philistines doing the same thing back to Samson. They keep treating each other with brutality and treachery and cunning, and so they keep receiving brutality, treachery, and cunning because they're operating out of a worldly way of thinking. So what happens next? Verse 11. Then 3,000 men of Judah. Why 3,000? You're just going up against one Samson. Why 3,000? Because they knew who Samson was. They knew that this is a man that the Spirit of Yahweh came on. He was a judge, so they needed 3,000 men of Judah because you could have just sent 10 men for a normal person, right? But 3,000 men went to go capture Samson, probably to try to intimidate him in some way. But here you have 3,000 men of Judah coming out. And they went down to the cleft of the rock at Edom, and they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us?" Interesting for them to capitulate like that. "What then have you done to us?" He replied, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." Victim blame game going on again and again and again. Verse 12. They said to him, "We have come down to bind you, so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." So you almost have here Samson conceding to them, saying, "Well, okay, I guess you are going to give me over to them, but as long as you don't kill me, right? As long as my own people don't kill me." Verse 13, they said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now notice here, the men of Judah give up Samson, their judge, the one who God has anointed as deliverer, who the Spirit of Yahweh comes on in a mighty way to bring deliverance from the Philistines. The men of Judah, their king, they give up. How backwards is this? How deep down the steep spiral are we now? That the people who want their king give their king up to their foreign rulers, right? Samson, the deliverer. Look at how far down we've come, the downward spiral. This is absolutely ridiculous. Because they knew the story of Gideon and all the other past stories of how God, through miraculous means, really, delivered his people up. But now they want to give Samson over? Come on. This is how out of line all of this is getting, and it's ridiculous at this point. It's easy just to gloss over it, but we really do need to pay attention to it because this is what is happening, even though it's just like a broken record on repeat. It's just the same thing over and over again, but it keeps getting worse. Verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of Yahweh rushed on him. And the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that had caught fire. Now remember, Samson's name means little son. So the fact that the ropes become like flax that has caught fire is sort of a throwback to his name, right? Because you can't bind fire. And the bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Well, a jawbone of a donkey can only be a jawbone of a donkey if it's dead, right? He found a fresh one. So again, defiling himself. He reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men. That's a lot of men to kill. And so the 3,000 men of Judah coming down makes more sense if Samson's able to kill 1,000, right? So what does Samson do after he's handed over to the Philistines? For them doing this wrong to him, he then does a wrong right back to them. He kills 1,000 of them. Verse 16, and Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. So he's sort of praising himself to a certain extent. Verse 17, when he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. By then he was very thirsty. Yeah, after killing 1,000 men, you probably would be. It's quite a workout. And he called on Yahweh. Oh, Samson is finally acknowledging Yahweh. But what for? Let's read. Saying, you have granted this great victory by the hand of your servant. Okay, that sounds pretty good. You're acknowledging you're his servant and that this great victory comes by him, right? Am I now to die, Samson? Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So why is he calling out? Because he was thirsty. Is it to glorify Yahweh? Well, not really. Not really. It's because he's thirsty and he has no other choice but to call out on Yahweh because, well, he doesn't have water. Because if he did have water, he wouldn't be calling out on Yahweh. We know that. So he is probably taking his mechanistic understanding of Yahweh, because he probably wasn't taught very well by his parents because they didn't seem to know what was going on. At least his father Manoah didn't. Right? And so he knows that when you're in trouble, when you're in a time of turmoil, what do? You call out on Yahweh. And so he does because he thinks he's going to die. But it's because he's thirsty, not because he wants to glorify Yahweh or show him any kind of respect. But what does Yahweh do? So God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came from it. God heeded him because God is not intimidated by our misunderstanding or thinking that we are manipulating him. He's not intimidated by that or needs to put us in our place. He's the sovereign God of the universe no matter what. He does not need to make sure we have a proper understanding before he heeds something. Because remember, Samson is basically a picture of the hardening of the heart of the Israelites. And so for God to do this, when Samson probably has a misunderstanding of what's going on, doesn't surprise us because they're already doing what they're going to do, Samson and Israel. So for God to act in this way, from a point of probably misunderstanding from Yahweh, is not a big surprise because the sovereignty of God does not change, even if Israel's understanding of him is skewed, right? So then continue on, verse 19. When he drank, his spirit returned and he revived. Therefore it was named En-Hakkore, which is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So it kind of like a pause, like a big break of time is going to happen here, sort of. But he drinks, he's satisfied, he's revived, and things move on. Notice there's no talk of him giving thanks to what just happened. Because Samson is inherently selfish. He's thinking only of himself, and he calls out on Yahweh in a time of need, when he's in turmoil. Not in a time to be thankful or to glorify him or to seek him, only in a time of need. And so we see here through this last part of this instance, the men of Judah give up their king, but yet their king still is reigning, right? Because he destroys the Philistines. And Samson calls upon Yahweh to give glory? No, sorry. It's to satisfy his thirst. So let's look up at Titus 1, verse 6. Where are you, Titus? Titus 1, verse 6. Is that supposed to be Titus? Oh, 1:16, excuse me. Here we go. They profess to know God, but they deny him by their actions. One of the things we see happening with Samson is that, kind of in that instance we just looked at, he professes to know God. He calls upon God and asks for his help. But his actions show that he does not really know Yahweh. His actions show that he disregards him, right? Because he's not even keeping his Nazirite vows. So Titus is a great scripture to help balance out your understanding of what you're experiencing in your life, because you may find people who say the right things, who have some understanding of how God works, but the way that they live their lives, their actions just do not line up with it, and it causes a lot of friction. And so we see this happening in Samson's story at this point. He kind of says the right thing, but his actions from the very beginning show that he couldn't care less about who Yahweh is or who Israel is. All Samson cares about is Samson. One of the things I want you to notice here, where is Yahweh in all of this? Because he's basically silent in the scripture up until this point. And we know that Samson is just merely calling out on him, but he's not really wanting to pursue God. Where is Yahweh in all this? Remember, he's been rejected as king, but yet the sovereign God of all the universe is still there. And he is silent, and Israel, that whole area, has really become like the Wild West. Everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, and justice being served up by the hands of other people. And no one is really showing any regard for one another. Why? Because the way of the world is brutality, treachery, and cunning. And we're seeing these happening in flying colors with Israel and its enemies, and also with Israel amongst itself. Think about what the men of Judah did in giving up Samson. There's some brutality and treachery and cunning mixed up with that, right? Because they're trying to save their own skin instead of backing their king. So it's just interesting to sort of look at some of that stuff in this story, and to see kind of how God is silent, but he's still working in the backgrounds. Because if we look at what God's response is to all of this, is we're seeing that Samson's heart is sort of being hardened here. Because God, let's look at the scripture, because Samson was saying he's thirsty, and you've granted this great victory, am I now to die of thirst? And God heeds him. But don't you think that God heeding Samson at this point is only going to reinforce Samson's idea that God can be manipulated? Yeah. Because they are receiving what they have sown. Samson is receiving what he has sown, and God is helping harden his heart to a mechanistic understanding of Yahweh, because that is what he has sown this whole time. Samson is reaping what he has sown. And in the end, you know how the Samson story ends. He gets captured, then he destroys the foreign god temple with all the Philistines inside and ends up killing himself too. What you see here is the sovereign God of the universe, the true king of Israel, defeats Israel's enemies, and he uses whatever means necessary to do so. Even though Samson doesn't regard Yahweh, Yahweh still uses him. And this is going to get to our practical application later of being an instrument and being an agent. Samson here is a great picture of an instrument. He has no idea what's going on, but yet Yahweh uses him, and yet Samson still gets the fruit of his own understanding, because he gets what he needs from God, but he doesn't understand what's really going on, right? And it only serves for him to continue to think of God as one who can be manipulated. But Samson's in the wrong, but God does not feel intimidated like he has to somehow correct Samson and make sure he thinks in a perfect way about it. It doesn't really work like that. And so we see here that God cannot be intimidated into showing himself to be God, right? He's not like these foreign gods that need to defend themselves and get offended, right? Yahweh's not like that, because he is the sovereign God of all the universe, and he is the true king of Israel. And even though his people rebel, he still keeps his covenant. He still subdues all of Israel's enemies and keeps a remnant alive who truly do know him. And so that's one of the interesting things happening here. And we'll pick up the next part of the Samson story in the next video.